Muy, muy buenas tardes a todos. Ya ahí se va conectando la gente de a poco. Les queremos agradecer a todos su participación. Em, ya estamos ahí en condiciones para poder comenzar. Chen Yong, ahí te invitamos a poder prender tu cámara. Muchas gracias. Vamos a comenzar. Durante el transcurso también de la presentación se va a ir sumando más gente a este webinar, pero me gustaría partir presentándote. Eh, el doctor Chen Yong-tan es profesor asociado y también director del doctorado en educación de la Universidad de Hong Kong. Y su investigación se centra en cómo el hogar y la escuela influyen en el aprendizaje y el desarrollo de los estudiantes, particularmente con un énfasis especial en el liderazgo escolar y su efectividad en distintos contextos. Publica habitualmente en revistas de alto impacto como Educational Research Review, Review of Educational Research, por ejemplo, y además ha sido revisor invitado de proyectos competitivos tanto en Austria, Israel y Singapur, así como del Informe Mundial de la UNESCO sobre liderazgo escolar en Singapur. En este webinar compartirá evidencias recientes sobre el liderazgo escolar, mostrando cómo las prácticas de liderazgo varían en su efectividad según los contextos y cómo los líderes pueden adoptar sus prioridades para mejorar el aprendizaje y la efectividad escolar. Tras su ponencia, vamos a abrir un espacio para preguntas, donde esperamos que ustedes nos las puedan ir compartiendo en el chat, ese espacio el cual moderaré yo. Antes de comenzar, les queremos informar que esta sesión se encuentra con traducción, la cual ustedes pueden activar en el panel inferior que aparece en Zoom y deberían ver una opción de traducción y ustedes pueden escoger español y van a escuchar toda la presentación de Chen Yong en español. Así que eso lo queremos dejar ahí como bien claro, eso lo pueden hacer ahora y poder activar eh, la opción para la traducción. Dicho eso, para nosotros es un honor contar con tu presencia en este webinar, Chen Yong. La verdad es que nos pone muy contentos. Soledad también ahí se encuentra entre los asistentes, te mando un saludo. Así que nos pone muy contentos y por favor, adelante te dejamos para que nos puedas presentar.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So thank you to Christian and Sudalek for inviting me to share some of my research and ideas on how school leadership actually contributes to students' learning by interacting with the environment or the context. Let me share my screen and we will continue. Okay. So we will call it contingency of school leadership for student learning. So the big questions that we're going to address in this presentation: why do schools differ in their effectiveness? What school leadership practices are more effective than others? What contextual factors shape school leadership responses with different impacts on students' outcomes? How do school leadership priorities adapt for emerging contingencies that happened? And how do contexts moderate leadership effectiveness? So these are the 5 big questions that will guide our presentation today. So the outline of the presentation, I have in mind to talk a little bit about advancement in the school effectiveness scholarship before coming to the conclusion that we have to recognize context in school leadership research. And I will share with you specifically 4 studies that I have published that examine different types of contexts, and we'll end off with some reflections. So first, let's briefly visit the history of educational effectiveness and leadership in the literature. We have to go back to Coleman report that was published in 1966. What happened then was Coleman and his colleagues were commissioned by the US government to do a very big study to understand what are some things that schools are doing that contribute to school effectiveness. So they have a big sample, 3,000 schools, more than 600,000 students in the 60s. That's a big sample. And their findings were very surprising. They find that the social composition of the student body is more related to student achievement than is any other school processes. What that means to say is that they find that schools, whatever they're doing, doesn't seem to work very well. What seems to be more predictive of students' achievement levels are actually who the students are, the intake qualities. And you can imagine that sets a lot of people at that time very upset. People are wondering, if schools do not add value to students' learning, then why are we having schools? So this anxiety, this reaction to the Coleman report spawned decades of what we call educational effectiveness research. And this is an article that's published in 2014 by David Reynolds and colleagues in the School Effectiveness and School Improvement Special Issue. It's a very good review article, and I'm going to use it a little bit to frame this talk. So in the article, Reynolds and colleagues charted 4 different phases of school effectiveness research, from the initial phase in the 70s, where they reacted to Coleman's report to try to prove that there are things that schools are doing that help students to learn, and that Coleman's report is not very accurate. Then the research went on to the second phase in the 80s, where researchers used more multi-level methodologies to try to demonstrate that, well, school effects is dependent on the inputs that comes in, be it teacher quality, be it students quality, and then you have the output in terms of student achievement. Then we move on to the third phase in the 90s, where researchers start to understand the process part that's in the middle. So they study with the same input intake of students, what do schools do to help their students to generate the output. So this is the school processes. And we're now in the 4th and 5th phase, whereby school effectiveness researchers starts to talk to school improvement scholars. So now we are not just talking about whether schools are having high levels of achievement. We're also talking about whether there's value added. So that's a notion of school improvement. We're also talking about school processes at different levels, be it the classroom, be it the school, or even the district level, and we have a lot of international studies. Now, we have gone through these 5 phases of school effectiveness research scholarship development. So what is next? I will argue that to advance the field, we need to recognize the importance of context in school leadership research. Now, what do we mean by context? Phil Hellinger, in an email study published in 2018, very highly cited, talks about the importance of bringing context out of what he calls the shadows of leadership. Now, what context is he talking about? He mentions 6 types of context: institutional, community, national, cultural, economic, political, school improvement. And so this is one framework that we are going to bear in mind to help us understand the importance of context. And the second framework I would like to share is the contingency opportunity leadership theory. This is a leadership situational theory, but I like this very much because it's very specific in terms of helping us to understand how leadership responds to the context to shape students' learning. So it answers 2 questions. The first was, how do leaders adapt their practice to exploit opportunities in the environment? And second, when there are challenges in the environment, how do school leaders overcome them to achieve school goals? So exploiting opportunities, overcoming challenges. So this is also a framework that I have used a lot in my studies to help make sense of my findings. This is a summary of the 4 studies that I'll be covering today: institutional context, community context, and economic political context. I will use these studies to answer the few big questions that we have for this presentation. So the first study, The first study compares the effectiveness of school leadership practices. This is a study that's published this last year in Email with Clive Dimmock and Alan Walker. What we did was we did a 3-level meta-analysis to try to identify school leadership practices that are more effective for student outcomes. The impetus for the study, for decades, we've been talking about how important it is for school leaders to focus on teaching and learning. This is what we call instructional management. But the big question is this the best thing for school leaders to focus on? That means instructional management. Are there other things that school leaders can do or are even more effective for students' learning? This is the big question that we're going to answer in this meta-analysis. So the quest is to identify leadership practices that are the most impactful for students' learning. So specifically for the study, we want to examine associations between school leadership practices and student outcomes, and to understand if this association varies with context and with methodology. This is the conceptual framework for the whole study. So we investigated 9 types of school leadership practices to see how they affect student outcomes. So we have school leaders enhancing teaching and learning, building shared vision and values, focus on learning. This is what we call instructional management. And we're going to code it in red so that we can see later when I show you figures. We have a second set of school leadership practices, what we call enhancing teacher capacity. So there are 3 types of practices, whether school leaders provide professional development, whether they empower teachers, and whether they motivate teachers. These are all coded in green. The ones in blue are what we call organizational responsibilities. School leaders managing resources in the school and school leaders redesigning the school. And lastly, external stakeholders engagement. These are coded in purple. We talk about school leaders engaging families and community and managing external accountability and relationships. So there are 4 steps in this meta-analysis. First, we identify potential studies, and we have about more than 16,000 studies that we found. So we apply inclusion and exclusion criteria, and that helped us to eliminate more than 16,268 studies that are not relevant. So we're left with 108 studies in our meta-analysis. We coded the studies details and we calculated effect sizes. And what are the findings? The first finding is that school leadership contributes to student learning in different contexts, but it has a small effect size. And the school leadership effects applies for both principals and teacher leaders. It applies for grade 1 to 6 schools and grade 7 to 12 schools. This is a summary of the effect sizes for the different leadership practices. So for example, when school leaders focus on enhancing teaching and learning, it correlates at 0.11 with students' learning outcomes. So again, you can see these are in red. This is about instructional management. These are in green. These are practices about school leaders developing teacher capacity. This is actually in blue, but you can't see the bar because they're all not significant. It's about school leaders managing resources in the school. And the last 2 in purple are about school leaders engaging the community, engaging families. Now, from this, we can see very clearly, the tallest bar are those that are most effective for student learning. And actually, the best predictor of student learning is when school leaders manage external accountability and relationships, 0.26, followed by engaging families and communities and empowering teachers. In contrast, if we look at instructional management, when school leaders focus on teaching and learning alone, the effect sizes are actually very much smaller compared to empowering teachers and external stakeholders engagement. Now, managing resources and redesigning the school has no effect on students' learning. We will talk a little bit about this later. So this is a snapshot of what the meta-analysis is telling us in terms of what school leaders could be considering to do for improving students' learning. So the second key takeaway is that beyond instructional management, school leaders need to do things like enhancing teacher capacity and engaging external stakeholders. And we find that, as what I've shared earlier using the figure, the effect size is larger when school leaders focus on engaging external stakeholders as compared to instructional management. And the biggest effect size comes from school leaders managing external accountability, followed by engaging families and communities and empowering teachers. This is a figure that summarizes the effect sizes of school leadership practices on different areas of students' learning. So you can see again, 0.14 means school leadership practices correlated with language achievement at 0.14. So you can see that basically what school leaders do, it affects students' language achievement, math achievement, social science achievement, and learning attitudes and processes. It does not seem to affect too much science achievement or educational attainment of students' learning. So that's the third key takeaway. So the effect seems to be stronger: language, math, social sciences, and processes. And I think the processes part is important because now in many school systems, we're talking about enhancing students' motivation, letting them enjoy learning. So we have finished the findings from study one, which finds that it's important for school leaders to engage external stakeholders rather than just looking inwards, managing instructional management. In this second study, we're going to find out how school leaders respond to context. So the big question is, do school leaders shape the environment or do they adapt to the environment? If they adapt to the environment, how do they do it? This is a study that is published in Asia Pacific Education Review last year, and I focus on science learning. The big question to answer in this study is, how do school contexts shape principal leadership practices? I use data from more than 280,000 15-year-old students from more than 9,000 schools in 35 OECD countries from PISA 2015. Now, PISA 2015 focuses on science. So I use a lot of the data on science resource availability from schools, science teachers' qualifications, student and school SES, principal leadership. I could easily differentiate the 35 countries in terms of whether they're Confucian cultures or whether they are not. Also from PISA, we have data on student science enjoyment, interest, and achievement. So we did multiple imputations because there are missing values in PISA, and we did what we call three-level structural equation modeling. This is the conceptual framework. So we have four types of principal leadership practices. They are measured, whether principals do envisioning, they focus on teaching and learning, whether they do instructional management, whether they develop teachers, and whether they empower teachers. And we want to find out whether school context influences these practices. By school context, we're talking about school SES, the qualified teachers in the schools, and whether schools have educational resources. Then we want to find out whether what principles do affect students' science learning enjoyment and interest, which in turn affects their science achievement. And the finding shows that first, in schools where we have high SES, and this is one of the contextual factors, school principals do less envisioning, they do less teacher professional development and less teacher empowerment. It could be the case that in such schools, there's less need to do audits. So this is a figure that shows all the relevant significant pathways from context to principal practices to students' learning outcomes. So for example, if you look at school SES, it's correlated negatively with envisioning of the principal. It's also correlated negatively with principals promoting professional development and negatively with principals empowering teachers. So this is what I have said. And in such schools where principals do less professional development, less students tend to have higher levels of enjoyment and interest in learning, and that contributes to their science achievement. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, low SES schools, they may have more shortages of teachers and resources, and therefore they do more envisioning. Principals also concentrate on developing teacher capacity. So it's a very interesting picture that we have found from this PISA data. The second key takeaway is that among the 4 school leadership practices, only instructional management contributes to student science enjoyment and learning and science achievement. So if you were to focus on this set of red bubbles here, this is principal instructional management. When principals do more of this, it's positively correlated with student science enjoyment and also science learning interest. And these 2 variables then contribute to science achievement. So we have seen this second study where we talk about how in high SES school context, school principals actually do less of many things. And in low SES context, school principals got to focus on envisioning, focus on professional development and so on. And that all this influence students' learning attitudes and outcomes in science. Now, in this third study that I'm going to share, we're going to talk about the community context in terms of COVID. We have all passed COVID 5 years ago, and it was a very challenging time and challenging duration of time during COVID. This is a study, a systematic review that I've done with some colleagues and published in the Educational Research Review. So in this study, we want to do a systematic review to understand internationally the different challenges to teaching and learning that school leaders were confronted with during school closures during the pandemic. And we'll recall during the pandemic, at least in Hong Kong, where I'm based, there were many, many rounds of school closure, opening, and so on. In fact, in Hong Kong, we have 5 rounds. You can imagine how chaotic it was. In fact, internationally as well, I understand. And the big question is, what are these challenges and how the school leadership responded to these challenges? This is a systematic review. So first, we try to identify all the studies that were published in the 4 years during the COVID era. And we found more than 7,780 studies. We applied inclusion and exclusion criteria, and that it excluded 7,554 studies. Next, we coded details from these 226 studies that were left after the exclusion, and we used thematic analysis to derive themes on the challenges and responses. And what are the findings? The first key takeaway is that schools had to do a lot more with less resources in a rapidly changing environment. And schools had to struggle with continuity of students' learning and also addressing the well-being of the entire school community. And some students during the COVID school closure suffered a lot more than others. So school leaders got to address issues of inequity. And this inequity we'll see later, it's double fold, arising at the school level and also at the family level. These are the 9 teams that we have. 8 teams that we have, right? Regarding challenges that school leaders face. So first, they have to respond to the challenging external environment. A lot of the school leaders were not prepared to implement rapidly changing pandemic policies of their own governments. And school leaders find that they have an intense need to engage with different stakeholders. So life became more complicated. It's not just them addressing the learning needs of the students. They also have to look after the families because a lot of the families were in distress. They have to look after teachers because a lot of teachers themselves are infected. They have children also to look after. So it's very, very intense need to engage with these different stakeholders. The second set of challenges where school leaders have to implement home-based online teaching and learning during the pandemic, and there are consequences. First, many schools have great difficulty moving to online teaching and learning. You can imagine a lot of teachers are not trained. A lot of schools do not have the kind of technological resources. And even when they implemented it, they have difficulties. We hear a lot of stories of students during COVID when lessons were online. They do not want to turn on their cameras while learning from home, and they do not have social interactions. So they feel very stressed out. There were big achievement gaps and social emotional well-being, especially for disadvantaged families, because these students may not have laptops at home to do online learning. They may not have the space for a few children to do online learning at the same time at home. And these students may also attend schools that are disadvantaged, where teachers are not trained to do this, and where schools do not have enough laptops for teachers to do online teaching. You can imagine the consequence is a lot of learning loss that were documented. And the third set of challenges, school leaders got to do more with less. They have a lot of resource shortage. During COVID, a lot of teachers could not work. A lot of parents struggle with online teaching and learning for their young children. They may also have to work online themselves at home, so they cannot support the school. There were a lot of basic needs that the schools need to address. During that time, a lot of families and schools, they were very concerned about how not to get infection. So learning becomes secondary. And there is limited scope for teacher leadership at the time at the school level because the situation at that time was so chaotic. And you can imagine school leaders got to be more directive to galvanize the school, to move the school ahead to the best of their ability. So teachers have little room to play outside the classroom. And there is deteriorating social emotional well-being internationally. So there are many research that shows that principals themselves are very stressed. Teachers do not know what to do. Parents are caught in trying to ensure the safety of their family and also the continuity of learning of their children. And the students themselves, they have learning loss and they also could not interact a lot with their friends and teachers. So there's deteriorating social emotional well-being. The second set of findings we have is regarding leadership responses. Now, to address all these challenges, our school leaders were very, very adaptive. They were flexible. They used different types of leadership practices to address the challenges. And at the end of the pandemic, a minority of schools were documented using experiences from the pandemic to improve the schools for future contingencies. Specifically, there were 5 teams on these leadership responses. They use what we will call adaptive leadership. That means they do different things just to adapt to the situation to keep things going. Some of them also practice community-based leadership. That means they don't just rely on themselves to lead the school community. They work a lot with community stakeholders, whether it's donation of masks, sanitizing agents, whether it's loaning of laptops, and so on. And they try their very best to facilitate student learning during the pandemic. A lot of them got to switch to technology to exercise instructional leadership. So we recognize that there's a lot more digital instructional leadership going on at that time. For teachers, because there are so many teaching and learning that are done online, and during the online sessions, the teachers are the one in charge, and they have to adapt to their students' needs. So they exercise leadership within the classroom, what we call agentic leadership in the classrooms. And both school leaders and teachers, they try their best to maximize teaching and learning. In terms of resources and teacher capacity, school leaders try to provide whatever resources they could, whether it's from the school or outside the school. And they do a lot of on-job training, a lot of just-in-time training for teachers' professional development to equip teachers, to prepare teachers to do online teaching and learning. And school leaders got to address school communities' well-being. I've shared before, that includes their own well-being, right? That includes also teachers' well-being, students' well-being, and even the parents' well-being, because all these are affecting the progress of teaching and learning during that time. And finally, when they look to recovery from COVID, they prepare transition the students to go back to school. They look at innovation, and for some schools, it's very encouraging that they try to future-proof their school by having e-learning plans for the school, so that in future, when there's another such crisis, they know what to do. They can switch their teaching and learning online. So these are the responses from the school leaders to address the challenges during COVID. So we go on to the fourth and last study. In this study, we're going to talk about how family and school SES moderate school leadership effects. Family and school SES are what I will call economic and political context. This is a study that's published a few years ago in the Cambridge Journal of Education. And the aims of the study is to examine the moderating influence of different contextual variables on school leadership effects on student achievement. So by context here, we're talking about student SES, students' prior achievement levels. We're talking about the quality of different types of school resources and the levels of parental expectations. So the big question that motivated this study is, do leadership practices need to change for different school contexts? Or can school leaders just do the same thing, regardless of what schools they are leading? The sample comprises more than 10,000 principals and more than 250,000 students from 32 countries in PISA 2012. In PISA 2012, they focus on math achievement, so we use that data. They also have data on 4 types of principles leadership practices. We'll see that soon. There are data on teacher variables, teachers' morale, autonomy, and the focus on students. There is data on student SES, students' prior achievement levels, school resource shortages, and parental academic pressure. And I use a mixture of latent class analysis and hierarchical linear modeling in the analysis. Well, why latent class analysis? This is an analysis that helps us to decompose the big sample. Remember, we have more than 250,000 students into subgroups. So the question is, are these 250,000 students in this big sample homogeneous? Are they similar? Or do they belong to different subgroups? If they belong to different subgroups, then we have to find an objective way of identifying these subgroups and then to do analysis on each subgroup individually to be more accurate in our results. So in latent class analysis, and this is a sample of the results, we can test for one class solution. That means the whole sample is homogeneous. We can test for 2 class. That means the sample, the big sample, comprises 2 subgroups, 3 classes, and 4 classes. And these are all objective. It's not up to us to decide, but rather we look at the stats and we decide how many groups are there in the sample. And we found that actually the big sample of students here comprises 3 groups. We call them the disadvantaged group, average group, and privileged group. And I will tell you a bit more why we name it as such. And when we look at the different variables that we're measuring for each of these groups, we can see very clear patterns of who these students are. In this first group of students, more than 24,000 students, they have, compared to the other 2 groups, the lowest level of math achievement. You can see this average group, 490. In score, the privileged group, 510. This group only 428. This group of students attend schools where the principals do the minimum instructional management, minus 0.08 compared to minus 0.02 and 0.12. And in this group of students, they have teachers who are have the lowest level of morale compared to the other 2 groups, teachers who have the least amount of autonomy, and teachers who focus on student-centered teaching and learning moderately, right? And in terms of SES, these students come from the lowest SES family. They can compare minus 1.11 as compared to minus 0.02 and 0.23. This is the biggest, right? And in this group, the students attend schools where they have a bigger shortage of teachers, where you have a weakest quality of educational resources, and where the quality of infrastructure is the lowest. And these students also have parents who have the lowest level of expectations for the academic learning as compared to the other two groups. So it's very obvious to us. This group of students, 24,882 of them are from disadvantaged families who attend disadvantaged schools. Now, in contrast to this, if you look at privileged students, this is about 49,757 students. They have the highest level of math achievement, 510 as compared to 490 and 428. In those schools that these students attend, in terms of principal instructional management, they have the highest level. So principals do a lot of instructional management in these schools. Teachers morale, they have highest level of morale in these schools. It seems to be high SES schools. Teachers have the most autonomy, and teachers focus on student-centered teaching most in this type of schools. In terms of SES, these students come from the highest SES families, 0.23, as compared to minus 1.11, minus 0.02. This is the biggest number. In terms of the schools that they attended, these schools have in fact, the best educational resources and infrastructure quality. And they have the least shortage of teachers, qualified teachers, minus 0.55 compared to these schools. In terms of parental expectations, these students have parents who expect the most in terms of the students' learning, 1.97 as compared to 1.76 or 1.85. So this group of students is what we call the privileged group. They come from very well-supported high SES families. They attend schools that have a lot of resources, where principals practice instructional management. And in the middle of these two, the biggest group of students is what we call the average group of students, where we have these numbers that are somewhere in between the two extremes. So these results show us that when we use a technique like latent class analysis, it's very effective to help us to understand the different subgroups of students in a sample. So that's the first key takeaway. So you'll recall we talked about disadvantaged students. That's the first group. Now these students experience what I will call a double jeopardy. So they come from disadvantaged in a family, they attend disadvantaged schools, and that contributes to poorer academic math performance. In contrast, the privileged students, that's the third group on the right-hand side of the table that I showed you earlier, they usually come from the highest SES families, they have parents with the highest expectations, and they attend the most well-resourced schools. And this double advantage, high SES families and also most well-resourced schools contribute to the strongest level of math achievement. That's the first key takeaway. This is a snapshot of the hierarchical linear modeling that we have done for each subgroup. So you see disadvantaged students, we did analysis here. Average students, we did a separate set of analysis. And also privileged students, we did analysis. So we did the analysis separately. And what did we find? We found that for disadvantaged students, principal instructional leadership has a positive effect on student achievement through higher levels of teacher autonomy and teacher morale. So that means principals who are leading schools with disadvantaged students, they can contribute to the learning of these students by exercising instructional leadership, by empowering teachers. However, it will also recall from the table I showed you earlier, in these schools for disadvantaged students, principal instructional leadership has the lowest level, teacher autonomy lowest, teacher morale also lowest. And therefore, this is a big problem. So principals leading these schools with disadvantaged students must reconcile this paradox. They should consider doing more instructional management equipping teachers with autonomy, and boosting the morale to help these students. And the last takeaway from this study is the relationship, a surprising relationship between principal distributed leadership and achievement of disadvantaged students. Well, what we find is that when principals exercise distributed leadership for disadvantaged students, there's a negative relationship, right? In fact, distributed leadership, we found that it's not significantly related for the other two groups of students as well. And therefore, especially when principals are leading disadvantaged schools, it may be more effective for them to take a more directive role in high-level strategic school-level decision-making and allow teachers to focus on teaching and learning within the classroom. This empowerment will allow teachers to make good local decisions in professional matters. So that's the fourth key takeaway. So I have finished sharing 4 studies that I hope illustrate the different contexts that affect school leadership effectiveness, be it institutional context, be it a community context, be it an economic, political context. So what can we conclude from these 4 studies? Well, to reflect on this, if you recall at the very start of this sharing, I talked about Hellinger's 2018 study, where he talks about different types of contexts. So to answer the big question, why do schools differ in their effectiveness? It's because of differences in context. We have to look at institutional context, that's the school, community context, national cultural context, economic context, political context, school improvement context. When we can recognize the context and adapt our practices accordingly, I think students will benefit. Second big question that we talk about at the start of this presentation, what school leadership practices are more effective? So the meta-analysis of 108 studies that I've shared earlier shows that when principals, when school leaders engage external stakeholders, they are more effective than just focusing on instructional management, enhancing teacher capacity, or doing organizational management alone for student learning. So engaging external stakeholders is key. But unfortunately, I think this is something that not all schools do a lot. The third big question that we address in this presentation, what contextual factors shape school leadership responses with different impacts on student outcomes? So our analysis of PISA 2015 data from 35 countries shows that in high SES schools, there's less envisioning actually, less teacher professional development, and less teacher empowerment. In contrast, low SES schools may have an opportunity to overcome the shortages of teachers and resources by doing precisely these things, doing more envisioning that focus on teaching and learning, developing teacher capacity to help the students. The next question that we address at the start, how do school leadership priorities adapt to address things that happen, or what we call emerging contingencies? So the systematic review of 226 international studies showed that during COVID, school had to do more with a lot less resources in a rapidly changing, challenging environment. And they had to struggle with ensuring continuity of students' learning and addressing the well-being of the school community. Now, in contrast, no, not in response to these challenges, school leaders were flexible in their leadership, and some of them even use experiences from the pandemic to improve their own schools for the future. And lastly, the question of how context moderate leadership effectiveness. We have seen that the analysis of PISA 2012 data from 32 OECD countries shows that principals can contribute to the learning of disadvantaged students most effectively by doing instructional leadership instead of distributed leadership. So these are 5 set of reflections and summaries from the studies that I've shown. And I hope this is helpful for our conversation going forward. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Chen Yong, por tu presentación. Les queremos recordar a todos los participantes que por favor pueden utilizar el chat para ir registrando sus preguntas. Pero me gustaría comenzar yo, y en el fondo tú instalas esta idea del liderazgo instruccional como un elemento importante, pero que uno podría quedar pensando que a la luz de los primeros resultados de tu estudio tienden a mostrar un efecto que pareciera ser no tan grande, y en general los efectos que tú muestras son relativamente pequeños, pero parecen ser los efectos de una foto. Y la pregunta es cómo ves tú ese efecto acumulativo que se puede ir dando en el fondo a lo largo del tiempo, así como la gota de agua al golpear la piedra, en el fondo no la erosiona el primer día, pero probablemente lo logra hacer eh, después de mucho tiempo, en el fondo. ¿Cómo ves tú esa idea de estos efectos y cómo pueden conversar a futuro, en el
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I totally agree. In fact, for school leaders, they have to do so many things, including instructional management. So even though the meta-analysis shows that the effect sizes are relatively smaller, but they have to still do it because it accumulates over time. Just like it will record the findings about school leaders managing resources, the meta-analysis shows that there's no effect of this practice on students' learning. But if school leaders do not manage resources within the schools, then there'll be chaos, right? So school leaders have to do different things, including instructional management. Now, the other thing to reconcile this finding that you have said, Christian, is this. If we're looking at schools overall, right, and the meta-analysis look at schools overall, then instructional management may not have a very big effect size. But if we're looking at disadvantaged schools alone, then it is much, much more important. So different strokes for different folks. And that's why in this presentation, I tried to focus on context. Context is so important. So if I am a school leader, if I'm leading a high SES schools, I may afford to focus on different things. But if I'm leading a low SES school serving disadvantaged students, I may want to focus on instructional management and to work through my teachers, increasing the morale and so on. Because we find from that study, international PISA data, that in a lot of low SES schools, teachers are not motivated, right? They don't have enough resources, and school leaders do not do enough instructional management. That's the paradox.
Sí, parece ser esta paradoja responde al contexto, como tú decías, y en el fondo los líderes escolares y también los tomadores de decisiones parece ser que tienen que ser muy hábiles en leer este contexto para poder poner en el fondo los incentivos y los esfuerzos necesarios en aquellos contextos donde más se necesita. Y parece ser que es una muy buena, es un mensaje muy bonito en el fondo, porque parece ser que aquellos que menos tienen más necesitan de este esfuerzo instruccional y los tomadores de decisiones parece ser que necesitan tener eso muy claro. Acá Jorge Roja nos pregunta, nos dice, cuando observamos a nuestros directores, no vemos esta separación de prácticas relacionarse con los padres, perdón, con esta separación de prácticas. Relacionarse con los padres implica tener un foco pedagógico también. Cuando apoya el desarrollo de sus docentes, tiene un foco pedagógico también, y entonces, ¿cómo ves la experiencia de los directores en su contexto cuando gestionan la cotidianidad? Y si es posible separar tanto el efecto es posible separar este efecto en nuestros directores.
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, we're talking about the interface between the school and parents and community. Am I right?
Así es, sí.
Okay. So I think the most natural way, natural platform to achieve this is parent-teacher cooperation or parent-teacher associations in many school contexts, right? I don't know whether parent-teacher association is a big thing in Chile. For example, in the Hong Kong context where I'm situated, the Education Bureau is trying very hard to encourage schools to set up parent-teacher associations and to bring parents into the school to try to support the schools, right? But naturally, you can imagine there are challenges and there's a lot of extra work done. But I think this is one strategy. And if you recall the results from the meta-analysis, engaging the community has the biggest effect size. And I find it a shame that sometimes in schools we don't do enough of engaging the family. Sometimes we feel that it's very difficult for the family to contribute. But if actually what they do makes sense, and it makes sense because if you think about it, students spend a lot of time at home after coming back from school. So who is the best person to help you to continue what they are learning in school at home? It's the parents, right? So parent homeschool cooperation, parent teacher association are ways to do it. In Singapore, we have what we call parents support group, where schools bring in parents to support a lot of functions of schools, what they're doing. And that's a kind of additional resources. And I think the parents also feel happy in a way because they can be involved to look at their children, how they are doing.
Acá me atrevería a decir, Chen Yong, que en Chile existe eh, una ya tradición cultural, digamos, de hacer la escuela un poco más abierta y en el fondo esta idea de incorporar a los apoderados, incorporar a los padres. Después podemos discutir si es que eso resulta o no, o si a los profesores en el fondo eso también sabemos cómo hacerlo. Yo creo que una cosa es declarar lo que queremos y otra cosa es hacer lo que queremos. Y parece ser que muchas veces viven en mundos distintos, pero parece ser que culturalmente acá en Chile esta idea de abrir la escuela un poco, de hacer partícipe al apoderado, que el apoderado sea un actor también dentro del proceso de enseñanza que viven sus hijos es importante. Soledad tiene una pregunta y nos dice, respecto a estos colegios con bajo nivel socioeconómico, ¿cuáles estrategias concretas de liderazgo tú recomendarías? Entiendo que también mencionaste algo del desarrollo profesional, pero no sé qué otras prácticas más instruccionales tú también recomendarías a la luz de la evidencia.
I think, again, going back to evidence, right? I think you also mentioned evidence in this whole enterprise. Important for schools, especially school leaders and teachers, to actually bring the family and the community on board, right? Bring on board, let them understand what the schools are doing, very important. Let them understand what they should be doing at home to support the schools. Now, in a different stream of research that I'm also doing on SES and cultural capital theory, what I found is that a lot of low SES schools, parents, they may have a different idea of what learning is about. Some of them may not realize that schools expect students to do homework, for example, to complete homework on time. Deadlines are important, right? These little things are what we take for granted sometimes in schools. So we must share with families that there are some things that they can do to help the school, to help their own children to do well in the system. So sharing education is very, very important. And I think the other thing that some low SES families may face is they may not feel adequate to contribute to the school. They may not feel adequate to engage teachers and school leaders. So with that regard, I think if we have a more collaborative setup, like what you said in Chile, where it's a more open door policy, when have more parents coming together, meeting teachers instead of just one-on-one, sometimes it's better. It reduces the anxiety of parents to engage with the teachers. And yeah, I think all this work together to accumulate in your words earlier, to work. And I think personally, I used to be a school teacher before and a school vice principal before. I think it's so important for schools to really bring the community and families into the school, right? We should not have the barrier. And so it's very, very encouraging to hear that in Chile, you have this open door community concept of the school. I think it can only benefit students.
Muchas gracias. Reinaldo nos pregunta, nos dice, los líderes deben crear escuelas dirigidas a una meta específica. Por ejemplo, escuelas para ingreso a la universidad, escuelas para ingreso a institutos, escuelas para ingresar al trabajo. Eh, o quizás es mejor, o debo entregar todas las opciones posibles a los estudiantes, aun cuando los resultados no siempre acompañan.
Oh, this is a very complex question, right? Yeah, but I think it's a real question, especially for secondary and high schools, leaders and teachers. Well, it's very hard for me to comment, but from what I see from different systems, and different systems do it differently, right? It's really not easy. First thing, I think in a country, the community have different ideas about what the different career educational tracks mean, whether it's vocational, technical, or academic as in university tracks, higher education. Maybe I can take the example of Singapore, right, to try to illustrate what I'm thinking. Well, in Singapore, we have the same situation. After high school, no, not even high school, after secondary schools, not all students will go to what we call a junior college. In a junior college, students do a 2-year program. They do A levels, GCE A levels, where they get prepared for university. Not every student can do it. So there's another 2 tracks. The first track is what we call a polytechnic track. This is where students do a vocational training and gets a diploma at the end of 3 years, right? So in Singapore, and Singapore is very small, so the government can actually do a lot of things with these polytechnics to equip them with very good resources and create a lot of opportunities for these students at the end of their diploma. If they're good enough, they can still enter the universities in Singapore. The third track that students have at the end of secondary 4 will be what we call the technical track. And again, in the Singapore context, the Institute of Technical Educations are very, very big, very, very well equipped, very, very modern. They look just like mini universities. And what the system is trying to do is to encourage people, encourage students who can't do the academic track to enter these tracks, these technical tracks, and move on, graduate with a technical certificate. And if they're good enough, they enter the polytechnics to get a diploma. And as I've shared, after diploma, if they're good enough, they enter the university. So there are many, many pathways to reach different goals. And if university degree is what they want, they still have an opportunity. And I think this is also what OECD recommended years ago, right? OECD felt that streaming and tracking, ability grouping too early is not good. And they felt also that in a system, in an education system, we must have different pathways for students at different points to exit and to join back another system if they like. Well, it's not easy to do this. In Singapore, we have a lot of problem as well. But this could be one example. Flexibility and mindset changes.
Acá vamos a volver un poco a esta idea del trabajo con las familias. Y Verónica Hernández nos pregunta, ella quisiera profundizar en qué se hace con las familias, qué tipo de apoyo, quizás nos podría ejemplificar un poco a través de la experiencia tal vez de Hong Kong y de Singapur, qué hacen esos sistemas educativos y en las escuelas particularmente para trabajar con las familias.
Well, Hong Kong and Singapore are very different. In Hong Kong, we have what we call school-based management. So you can imagine the Education Bureau would naturally want schools to have a lot of parents on board. But like what Christian you said also, in Hong Kong, we also face a lot of challenges. Sometimes at the school level, they find that welcoming parents, involving them will introduce a lot of complexity, a lot of extra effort and work, right? So in terms of what they do, well, you can support students learning and also support school functions, right? In Singapore, it is very different. I think I don't know whether I mentioned earlier, we do not have a lot of parent-teacher associations, but we have parent support groups. So what do schools do with parent support groups? Wherever they have a learning excursion, wherever they have an event, they bring parents on board. They look for parent volunteers to serve, to bring students, to look after students, to read to students, and so on. So they are really like extra teachers, if you think of it, right? And cutting across Hong Kong and Singapore, and I would say internationally, recently I've also been thinking and doing some research on the idea of how schools can support parents in what we call digital parenting. In today's context, we use a lot of technology, and a lot of parents have a big headache because their children use a lot of handphones and they are glued to their laptops, whether it's YouTube, Facebook or not Facebook, YouTube, and so on, Instagram. So the idea is, can schools do something to support parents, to equip them with skills to do better digital parenting, so that these parents at home, they can actually help their children to learn online, and there are a lot of opportunities online, and also to protect them from risks online, for example, cyberbullying. So digital parenting, I feel, is the next frontier to go for homeschool collaboration.
Para ir cerrando, te queremos comentar que acá en Chile estamos discutiendo una, estamos discutiendo acerca del rol de los directores y acerca de cómo los directores en el fondo pueden enfrentar o cómo podemos otorgarles más bien como sistema educativo una trayectoria profesional que les permita ir creciendo, ¿cierto? Evolucionando y también expandiendo, ojalá su influencia en el sistema educativo chileno. Los profesores tienen una ley de carrera directiva que comúnmente, perdón, de carrera docente que comúnmente se llama acá, que les fija tramos, les fija desafíos, ¿cierto? Un sistema de evaluación, pero no tenemos nada parecido para los directores. Me gustaría preguntarte, eh, desde la experiencia que tú manejas en el fondo, ¿cómo se vería un buen sistema de trayectoria directiva para los directores, poniendo foco en algunos de los elementos que ya nos has mencionado?
Wow, this is again a very complex question. Again, I think I will borrow a lot of ideas from the Singapore system. I think in the Singapore system, there are different career tracks for teachers and for school leaders. So what in Singapore, typically what happens is when a principal is posted to a school, he will stay there for a few years to see through the graduation of a whole cohort, one cohort of students. After that, number one, they can be posted to another school so that they can transfer their experience. Number two, they can be posted back to the Ministry of Education, right, to have a short stint so that they can look at policy issues. Track number three, they can be seconded to the National Institute of Education. That's where we train teachers to be a lecturer, a part-time, a full-time lecturer, adjunct lecturer. The idea is this: because they have a lot of practical experience, if they train teachers in a teacher training college, they can share that tacit practical knowledge with the teachers to be, and that benefits a lot of teachers. So these are some career tracks that I know in Singapore, we do that in Singapore. And I think overall, it benefits the whole system. You can imagine when school leaders can carry the experience from one school to another, they carry the experience to the Ministry of Education to do policy, they carry the experience to the teacher training institute to train teachers and future leaders. The whole system becomes very coherent. Everyone knows what everyone else is doing. There's a lot of transfer of learning. And it's really good for the system in terms of sustainability, in terms of mutual support, in terms of borrowing and leveraging whatever resources we have at the systems level. So I have also published something on that before. I think they coined the term ecological leadership in the system. So the system is not, in terms of leadership, when they talk about it, it's not just within the school, it's within the whole ecology of the education system. It's the same people doing different roles at different time. I think that's a powerful model that we can think about. But again, it may not work that easily for different systems. In Singapore, a lot of things can be done very easily because it's a very small system. You see, we only have 360 schools. In many other countries, we can't. Even in Hong Kong, where I am at now, Hong Kong is not a big system. We have more than 1,000 schools, but even then, it's so diverse. Most of the schools are non-public, so it's very difficult for the Education Bureau to do a lot of things to coordinate across. But these are some ideas that we can explore.
Nos quedamos con esta idea del contexto y cómo muchas veces también nos entrega oportunidades, además de desafíos. Y la verdad es que los líderes escolares tienen que ser muy hábiles en entender esas oportunidades. En el fondo somos, parece ser como muy fáciles y muy dados a ver el aspecto negativo de las cosas, pero parece ser que los líderes educativos están llamados a ver la otra moneda. En el fondo están llamados a ver el lado más positivo y el lado de las oportunidades, el lado de la innovación, que lo mencionaste en algún momento. Y yo creo que a raíz de la experiencia de la pandemia, nos pusimos todos en un modo de tratar de pensar distinto para poder enfrentar desafíos complejos y los líderes escolares, la verdad es que están destinados a enfrentar desafíos y están destinados en el fondo a superar barreras y a lograr objetivos que son difíciles, pero que también sabemos son realizables. Y en el fondo está lleno de experiencias, no solo en Chile, sino que en Singapur, sino que también en Hong Kong y en distintas partes del mundo de líderes efectivos que son capaces de marcar esa diferencia. Y la verdad es que los aportes que nos dan desde la investigación nos ayudan también a pensar de manera más crítica cómo podemos en el fondo aportar, ¿cierto?, a la política pública con un foco en la evidencia, pero también con un foco siempre en el aprendizaje de los estudiantes. Chen Yong, la verdad es que te quiero agradecer por tu tiempo, muchísimas gracias. Le queremos dar un muy gran agradecimiento. Él está a 12 horas en el futuro, nosotros estamos todavía en el día miércoles, Chen Yong enfrenta ya el día jueves y te queremos agradecer por tu tiempo, por tu disposición y vamos a seguir en contacto sin duda alguna. Así que muchas gracias.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share this. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, the audience. I hope this has been helpful. It has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Ya. Hasta luego, que estén muy bien.